Hi, I'm Stathis, your host. Before we jump in this episode, let me introduce DevRelX. DevRelX is a hub for developer marketing and DevRel professionals. Stay home while DevRelX brings you rich content to boost your DevRel game. Access developer population insights, news, job openings, and more. Discover how to empower developers and grow communities at devrelx.com. Today's episode will start with a quote from our guest.
Now, when you start building a community wrapped around a business and you create an environment, you facilitate an environment where your customers can play a role in the success of what you're doing, you can generate enormous amounts of value that you would never, you probably could never afford to pay for, and B, will focus on areas that you would never be able to prioritize.
Welcome to Under the Hood of Developer Marketing, our /data podcast. I'm Stathis, your host. It always makes me happy to see developer marketing growing. As we've said before, it's a rather new field with not so many resources for newcomers, and this is exactly the reason that led us initially to publish our book, Developer Marketing and Relations, The Essential Guide, and to create this podcast. But now the catalog of available resources is getting longer, thanks to great people like today's guest, Jono Bacon. Jono is a community and collaboration strategy consultant, an author, and a podcaster too, who has been very generous in sharing his experience and now has a new book called People Empowered, How Communities Can Supercharge Your Business, Brand, and Teams. Jono, welcome to the show. Will you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, it's great to be here, Stathis. Thank you for having me on. As a little bit of background, I think you already touched on the most important pieces. I work with companies to help them build communities across a really broad range of areas. I work with a lot of open source and technology companies, but I also work with companies that are in consumer products and banking and security and all kinds of places. And my basic goal in life is I'm firmly of the belief that communities don't just make the world a better place. I think we're a social species. We enjoy spending time together, but I think it makes businesses and companies more effective and more efficient because you've got this massive collection of people out there in your audience who've got time and insight and expertise. And if you weave them together in the right way, you can get pretty incredible results.
Yes, that's true. I totally agree there. But how did you end up in technology and then in communities? What was the driving force or the role model, if you want, that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people probably listening to this, it was a bit weird. I was living in England with my mum and dad. I was about 18, just about to go to university. And my brother came home and stayed for a couple of weeks. And he introduced me to this operating system called Linux, which back then nobody had ever heard of, including myself. But today is powering, data centers across the world and devices in your pocket. And when I discovered Linux, I discovered that thousands of people all over the world work together in building it. Right? They work together in an open source community, which back then, again, was not really a particularly well-known concept. This is in 1998. And I was just fascinated by this. How is it that you get these people all over the world to work together on the internet together to build something? This was way before GitHub and everything else. And for me, it just opened up a light bulb in my head, which was, I want to understand how you do that. Like, how do you really weave together the right kind of environment for people to build interesting things? I set up a couple of communities in the UK around open source and Linux, went on to work for an organization called Open Advantage, which essentially provided free consulting around technology and open source to people. That gave me an opportunity to kind of roll my sleeves up and jump into the deep end of how to do this. And then I went to Canonical, XPRIZE, GitHub. But the thing that has consistently been connected throughout all of this is always seeing newer and newer examples of how communities can deliver really interesting things, whether it's Wikipedia, Salesforce, HitRecord, Harley-Davidson, Kubernetes, TensorFlow, all kinds of different examples.
Yeah, that seems like a very good point, to start thinking about communities first. And I guess it was your brother that was the driving force behind all of this. It's great to hear. Yeah, that's great to hear. And honestly, we're very happy to have you on the podcast. And
thank you.
Spoiler alert for our listeners: we have on our upcoming Future Developer Summit. You'll be leading a fireside chat there.
Yep.
For our listeners who are not aware of it, the Future Developer Summit, it's our event organized by /Data, where thought leaders discuss the future of developer marketing and developer relations. So if you guys want to know more about our upcoming event or attend it, it will take place on April 7 and 8 at Menlo Park in California, focusing on engaging open source developers. You can see the full speaker lineup, the agenda, and tickets at futuredeveloper.io. So we'll have a fire chat there with Jono, and tease us a bit about it, how you think about empowering people, if you want, during the Future Developer Summit.
Yeah, I mean, I love, the one of the things I like about fireside chats is that it's not just me standing up there with slides waffling to an audience. I think people like to hear much more interactive discussion. And what I love about them is that we can get into all manner of range of topics, so when I'm working with communities, as I'm sure many of the people listening to this, there are so many different pieces that glue into that. It's how do you incentivize people? How do you build efficient developer on-ramps? How do you do content marketing and social media? How do you do events right? How do you build a set of kind of core principles and conduct to make sure you have a healthy community? And what I'm anticipating when we get into the fireside chat is really kind of touching on many of these, if not all of them, to try and get into some of the nuance of that. So, one thing I'd love to hear just from your listeners is like, what's the most interesting thing that they want to hear about? And you can email me at jono@jonobacon.com and let me know. So before I show up at the Future Developer Summit, I have a good sense of what the audience is looking for as well, because this is a big subject. There's a lot we can talk about that will span way beyond the fireside chat.
Yes, there's definitely a lot of things to say there, and we want to hear it too. So if you want to take your questions public on Twitter, Jono, how can they reach you? And
yeah, well, my Twitter, I mean, luckily having a name like Jono Bacon, it's such a ridiculously stupid name that I tend to have all of the usernames on the different services. So you can, on Twitter, it's Jono Bacon. On Facebook, it's Jono Bacon. On Instagram, it is Jono Bacon Graham, because somebody did take my username, which I was a little upset about. But yeah, Jono Bacon is on Twitter is probably the easiest way to send a message.
Yeah. That's definitely a reason to be upset about.
Right.
Also, if you take your questions to Twitter, please tag us, because we really want to know too. It's at /DataHQ. So thank you for that. And Jono, it's already within a few minutes that you're very passionate about communities. Why are communities important? And or if you want to make it a bit more specific, why should someone, when I say someone, I mean a business, should spend resources on building a community?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a big question. I think that the reason, let's start with the reason why they're important. I think when you take away the computers, the screens, the laptops, the phones, we're animals, and we're social animals, and we spend time together, and we do it for lots of different reasons. Thousands of years ago, we formed together into villages because we were stronger as a group. We could protect ourselves from the masses and from the enemy and from the elements. So we're an intrinsically social species, and we get a lot of value out of doing things together. It's why we form into businesses and into families and into book clubs and knitting clubs and everything else. So communities meet a very clear psychological need. But when you connect them to a shared mission or an ethos, whether that's building a community of developers, or it could be around a technology platform, or it could be something else, we can get really pretty remarkable results, right? So if you look at the data, Salesforce, Oracle, SAP have built communities of over 1 million people who get together to provide support and run events. You've got Harley Davidson, 1,700 local groups around the world. Fitbit, 1.8 million people who get together to talk about effective exercise and meal regimes. We've seen Wikipedia, which is valued at tens of billions of dollars by the Smithsonian. There's loads and loads of examples of value when we get together as a group. So for businesses, the value here is that, let's say you've got 1,000 customers or 1,000 users. they could be independently just doing their own thing, or if you weave them together into a community, they can create documentation, they can translate software, they can run events, they can do all kinds of different things if you build an environment that's meaningful for them to do that. But I think there is also a broader change that's happening, because if you look at the growth of technology, especially in the last 10 years, there are 6 billion mobile devices in the world. 4 billion of those are used for social media. 85% of millennials are carrying a phone in their pocket. The cost of a gigabyte of data in India is considerably cheaper than it is in the US and the UK. So technology is growing massively around the world. And we have younger generations who are growing up with technology and social technology. So they want to use technology to do meaningful and interesting work and form into groups. So the relationship that people have with companies is changing. Back in the old days, the only time you'd engage with the company is through their customer support line. And then as the internet grew, people would start sending newsletters and marketing materials out to their customers. But today, people want to go a step further and have a relationship with the companies that they care about. So to me, communities tick all of those different boxes. Now, they're not a walk in the park to set up. There's complexity there. There is risk there. But there's an enormous amount of opportunity to kickstart it.
Totally agree. It's, my idea is exactly in the terms you described it. It's that we're species that we seek each other's company, right, or working together. So online communities are a form of, it's a natural evolution of us people adjusting to the new tools that are now available. So I kept nodding while you were talking, obviously in agreement. And I did exactly the same thing when while reading a recent article you wrote on Harvard Business Review. And I will add a link to our episode descriptions for our listeners, so you guys can refer to it. It's really useful material. And there you're discussing about some advantages of companies, from transitioning the business model from the traditional product focus to a heavier focus on community building. So could you walk us through these advantages?
Yeah. So, the way businesses would operate, again, back in kind of the old days and the way some businesses operate today, is that you'd hire a bunch of people, they come into your organization, you work to understand the needs of your customers or your users, and then you build products and services that serve those needs. And historically, there'd be very command and control, right? You would have a senior executive team, they would hand the directives down to their VPs, and they would hand them down to their leaders, and they would hand them down to the people on the ground who would do the work or execute the tactics. And the disadvantage of that model is that it's always fundamentally dependent on your staff. It's always dependent on the people you pay to deliver that value. Now, when you start building a community wrapped around a business and you create an environment, you facilitate an environment where your customers can play a role in the success of what you're doing, you can generate enormous amounts of value that you would never, you probably could never afford to pay for, and B, will focus on areas that you would never be able to prioritize. So let me give you an example. Salesforce is actually a pretty good technology example of this. Salesforce, and they've got a whole range of different products, and they are so configurable that you could never write enough documentation to solve every possible use case. You could never have a support team that could answer every conceivable question. So the Salesforce community that's grown to over 1 million, what they call trailblazers, have produced just endless amounts of documentation, videos, events, training sessions, Q&A resources, where people can understand every nuance of how they build and how they use their product in their specific situation. And the key of what they've done there is they've incentivized how people do that. So when you join the community, and this is any good community will do this, it's not that you just show up and you're cheap labor. It's that you feel part of something. You feel that you're playing a role in something that's bigger than you. A good example of this is actually outside of the developer space. It's called Fractal Audio Systems, and I write about this in People Powered. They build musical equipment. Like, I'm a musician, I put music out there, and they've got a product called the Axe Effects, which is essentially it simulates a whole bunch of different guitar equipment digitally. There's 300 different amplifiers on there. It's incredibly configurable, very complicated. And their community has absolutely zero say in how they build their products and how they ship them and how they market them or anything like that. But they're incredibly passionate users of them. So in terms of how you create new sounds and how you understand all of the different amplifiers that are on the Axe-Fx, the community's built documentation, they provide answers, they organize local events, they do all of these different things. So communities offer all of that kind of value. The thing that companies often will be freaked out about, that they're nervous about is, am I going to give away the control to my community? And you don't have to in any stretch. What you have to do is you have to build an environment where people want to be, right? In the same way that people go to Disney World and they don't expect to be able to control what happens at Disney World, but they enjoy the experience of when they go there. And it's the same thing of what you do with communities. You create an environment where people feel part of something, it's meaningful for them, you build a sense of belonging, but you don't give away the keys to the castle. You just provide an environment where they can play a meaningful role in it.
Yes, totally agree there, and I really like the example you gave of the Disney World, yeah, because it's come up a couple of times. Community is a theme, I'd say, throughout all episodes of this podcast. More or less, it has come up. But I see, this fear of like handing over the control, which is not at all something like that,
right?
But it's also a way to help your users help each other, and as you said, Salesforce. It will be an endless page if they were to document.
Right.
Yeah, everything they're doing. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when a company considers building a community, what are some key elements they should definitely take into consideration before they start and throughout?
This is a great question, and this is. In many ways, one of the most complicated questions, because I think I touched on earlier on, communities are a weird cocktail of different things. There's the psychology, of how people think and operate and why we like to form into groups. There is the workflow of how you go out and like what infrastructure should you use and tools and what do those incentives look like. There's a lot of detail. And I think some people get a little bit put off by the amount of detail, and they consider the mountain too high to climb. This is one of the reasons why I wrote this new book, People Powered, is I wanted to provide a really simple framework for how to do this that I've kind of developed over the years. And I'll break it down here and people can find out a little bit more about it in the book. The first thing I think you need to do is to identify the value of what you want to, like, what is the value that you want to create? In my mind, everything has to start with value. If you can ask people to come and join your community, they're going to take time away from their friends, their family, the pub, their hobbies, and what's in it for them. And you got to start with that. A lot of companies will say, well, what's in it for us? What benefits do we get out of a community? But start with what you want your audience to get out of. And to do that, you first of all need to think about, well, who are our target audiences? And I like to define it based upon practical contribution. So, for example, for a developer marketing professional, a community could have people who are going to write code. It could be people who are going to produce documentation, provide support, run events, translate things, advocate what you're doing, all kinds of things. You've got to prioritize your communities first of all. And there's basically three models of communities out there. You've got what I call consumer, champion, and collaborator. Now, consumer communities are the usual kind of fans who get together because they like something, like Star Trek fans hanging out in a forum. The champion communities are people who are really big fans of your product, your service, kind of like my Fractal Audio Systems example, the guitar example, and they produce content and videos and provide help. And then collaborator communities are where people work together to build technology. And that will probably be of particular interest to this audience, but it subdivides into two areas. Inner collaborator communities are basically open source projects. You work together in exactly the same code base. And there's a lot of nuance in making sure that people feel part of the same team. But for outer collaborator communities, those are people who build, let's say, apps for the Google App Store, plugins for WordPress, extensions for other platforms. You build something that sits on top of a platform. And what people want there is just a simple, elegant developer experience. So you first of all define what is the model that you want to use and what are the audiences. But then the key thing here is to build out a set of what I call big rocks, which are your annual objectives, where you say, this is what we want to do in our first year. The challenge with a lot of communities is that they'll just kind of start poking the edges of what they can do. Maybe throwing a bit of content out there, maybe do a bit of social media, maybe run an event. But you got to be intentional about the experience, because what you're doing with the community is you're building a fixed experience about how someone can join and and consume the value that you've defined earlier on. And what we do is we track a set of objectives, which I call these big rocks. And the way in which we fill them up is I have a model that I call the community participation framework. And essentially, it's difficult to explain because it's a diagram. But what you want to do is when you identify your audience, you first of all want to onboard them so they can do something interesting, such as they build their first app with your SDK, or they produce their first piece of content, or they run an event. And then you got to simplify that onboarding experience so they can get up and running as quickly as possible, because a lot of communities, they suck at that. So people join the community and then they get stuck. But the next piece is they then flow through 3 phases of a community: casual, regular, and core. Now, what you're casual, once you've kind of gone up the on-ramp and you're going to start doing something, you're very nervous. You have a lot of imposter syndrome. You don't really know anyone. You don't really quite understand how the community works. So mentoring and guidance is critical in that casual phase. And then once you've built a habit, it takes about 66 days to build a habit. So you're used to going there most days in a week. You then become a regular. And when you're a regular, this means that you're just part and parcel of the community. And this is all about just doing consistent, interesting work and reducing bureaucracy. And in every community, a very small number of people will become core. These are your rock stars. These are the people you treat with white gloves. And what you want to do to move them through that journey is put lots of individual incentives, such as, okay, you've done your first contribution to the community. How do we get to the next 2 or 3? How do we get you more involved in events? How do we get you more involved in translations and other areas? And what you do is, as you design your community and you pick out your infrastructure and your tools, you track that in your big rocks, in your annual objectives. Because then what you're doing is you're building accountability in your planning. Because the problem with a lot of communities is that people come up with a lot of ideas and they enjoy the planning, but then they never track the execution of the planning. And one of the things I, again, walk through in People Powered is some maturity models around how you measure that and you make it more efficient as you go through it. And that is essentially the framework that I've found to be the most effective way of doing it. The good news is that, whether you've got 5 community managers helping you with this, or whether you've got half a person at someone's time, you can, it's as long as a piece of string, you can adjust how much you do based upon the resources that you've got available to you.
Yes, obviously resources are your bandwidth. And I really like how you use these rocks, the metaphor for, setting up your goals and using them, to build something more structured.
Right.
Obviously, you mentioned it a bit, but I'd like to hear more about it. Is what will make a community successful in the end depends on a number of things. What are some areas community leaders should keep track of to make sure they're on the right path? Some sort of metrics or key things to look out for.
So I think there's 2 pieces to this question. There is strategically, what should you do when building a community around a business? And then how do you ensure that the work that you're doing is successful? So let me start with some of the mistakes that people make. One of the mistakes that people make is that they go out and they hire a community manager or a developer relations person. And there's some remarkably talented people out there who do this kind of work. But they say to everyone in the company, that person's building our community. And then people naturally gravitate to going through that person, right? So if they've got a question for the community, they'll ask Sarah or Dan or whoever it is to reach out to the community. You really don't want to do that. What communities want is they want access directly to the people who work at the company. So part of this is setting the expectation in the company that the community is part of what we do. We build our products and services, and that's what keeps the lights on. But our community, the people who use them, and we need to care about that. And it should be everybody's responsibility to play a role in doing that. So your community manager should be there as a facilitator in running this work and doing great work, but everybody should play a role in that. So you need to incentivize and set expectations in your teams that they're going to play a role in this. A lot of people will be quite freaked out and nervous about how to do that when they start out. Like a lot of regular engineers, for example, in the company, be like, well, I don't entirely know what I should do. And what happens if I make a mistake and put a foot wrong or put my foot in my mouth? So you need to make sure that people feel comfortable in understanding what they need to do. And then that if they make a mistake, they're not going to get fired, because we have to be able to make mistakes when doing something new. So that's one piece. The other piece, and I touched on this earlier, is make sure that you execute on what your plans are. One thing that is a plague that is spreading through a lot of businesses is they spend lots of time in planning and articulating planning, and whether it's OKRs or whether it's a RACI matrix, whatever the latest planning methodology is, and how they're going to put those plans into the system and track them and this, that, and the other. And then 3 months later, they decide we're going to replan and do something else. I'm a huge fan of Iron Maiden, and they pull off these incredibly elaborate tours. Like I saw them a little while ago, and they brought a full-size Spitfire plane that they hover over the stage in their first song. And the guy who manages them, Rod Smallwood, was asked once in an interview, how do you pull off these incredibly elaborate tours? And he said, it's simple. You make a plan and you stick to it. So that's the other thing that's really critical. And that's why I like to build out the big rocks and all the individual tactics. But the other element I think that plays a really critical role here is always evaluating data and making changes on the data. Now, again, a plague that's spreading through businesses right now is what I call metrics fetishism, where people want to track every conceivable metric, and they have these dashboards with hundreds and hundreds of different metrics about everything, and they spend lots of time figuring out how they can track absolutely everything. Don't do that. Pick 5 things and track them well, and look at the data that you see and ask the question, what does this mean, and how do we make decisions based upon it? So I'll give you an example. I tend to use a forum called Discourse with a lot of communities. It's a really great open source community platform. And I track in there, for example, page views. So how many people are browsing your community or going to your community forum? And a lot of community members are window shoppers. They go and look at your community before they'd ever register an account. So page views are a good way to see general growth of visibility of your community. If the page views start going down, well, why is that? We need to get more exposure. But generally, you'll see the page views going up. But then I'll look at how many people are signing up. Now, if our page views are going up, but our signups are staying fairly flat, then that tells me there's not enough of a reason for people to sign up and actively play a role in the community. So from a reading perspective, we've been very successful. But from a signups perspective, we need to give more of a reason for people to sign up. We need to incentivize that. Another metric that I track is something called DAU/MAU, which is where you take the number of daily active users and you divide it by the number of monthly active users, and it gives you a percentage figure of stickiness, of how much people stick around. So, for example, if you keep seeing the signups growing in your community and the page views are going and the stickiness is staying the same, then you knew you're doing a good job, because the stickiness, if your stickiness goes down as you grow, then you know that you're losing people as your growth is coming in. So getting into a regular weekly cadence of, let's look at these 5 things that we care about, and what do we see here, and how do we hypothesize making changes based upon that data, I think is one of the most critical things that you should do.
Totally agree with everything. We're here as a company. We're data centric, obviously. We strongly believe in data, and my marketing background is hand to hand with metrics. This is the default.
Right.
This is how
Right.
all professional life has been. But I understand what you're saying. I've been to events, and one of those pretty recently, where I could see people being, let's say, scared of metrics, or kind of chaotic about what should I measure, how should I measure it. But I like the point you're making when you need to set those rocks, as you said. You need to find the metrics that match or reflect results with regard to do these rocks, which are your goals or what you're trying to achieve there.
I mean, I think one of the key things there is be intentional about your community. So be intentional about, what do we want to do in the next year? How are we going to measure this? What does success look like? And we start that evaluation of being intentional by, what is the value we want to create for which audiences, and how are we going to go about building that experience But then with the metrics, and this is where I think people have lost their way with metrics, is you say, what do we want to learn? So we pick metrics based upon what we want to learn, not can we measure it? Because we can measure, frankly, basically anything in communities that's digital. It's very difficult to measure kindness and compassion and empathy and the human elements of a community. But we can measure how many people are going to your website, how many pull requests have been submitted, what is the average time to first response. But what do we want to learn? And use that to guide your metrics, and then have a regular evaluation of what are we learning. And I think that will help you get up and running as quickly as possible, because there's no silver bullet to a community. We have to go through the process of discovering our insights in the same way that if people are listening within the context of this conversation around advertising, for example, marketing professionals who do advertising, it's the same recommendation with advertising professionals. What do? You set up a couple of ads, you target them, and you see how they perform, and then you make changes to your copy, your imagery, your creative, based upon the data that you see. And we essentially have to do the same thing with communities.
You said about Dan or Sarah, as you said, being responsible for building a community. So, which is the biggest mistake, where people just refer to them for whatever they need. Community-wise. So what are some things that when building a community our listeners should avoid?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is definitely avoid creating an ambassador to your community, that one person who everybody funnels their input through. Definitely avoid that. I think you should also, again, avoid a lack of accountability without wanting to beat a dead horse. If you're going to put together a plan, then you should stick to the plan. And if we're going to change the plan, there should be a good reason to change the plan, that we don't just throw things away and start a new plan willy-nilly. And that's not just a community management thing. That's just a general good best practice business thing to do, a professionalism thing to do, I think. I think the other thing that you got to be careful about with communities is creating a separation between the employees and the community that's too stark. Right. So one of the areas where I spend a lot of time working with my clients, apart from putting together these strategies and helping them to build those skills in their companies, is helping them to kind of get a sense of the balance of expectations between the company and the community. So as a general rule, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your community feels that they've got access to your company members, and they can work collaboratively within a set of parameters. There's going to be some things that your company are just going to have decision-making authority on. Many things, like what goes into your product, for example. They should have the final decision on that. Your community might want to feed into it and provide feedback and guidance, but you want to set those expectations clearly around where the line is drawn. So again, using Fractal Audio Systems as an example, they have never ever said that their product design will be determined by the community. They've made it very clear. We decide what goes into our products. That's just the way it is. And some companies tend to tiptoe around their community members because they're worried that they're going to annoy them or frustrate them or cause a public disaster. And my view here is, I'd rather disappoint you now than disappoint you in 6 months. I'd rather be upfront and set expectations than you have the wrong expectations. Then 6 months from now, we have to have an awkward conversation. So saying, for example, we control the trademark, we control the branding, we control what goes into the product. All of those kinds of things, be upfront about it, I think is really critical. The other thing I would say in terms of to avoid, don't overdo outreach. There's a common trend of companies who are starting to dip their toes into communities, that they hire let's say a DevRel person, and that person spends 90% of their time at conferences, speaking, working on social media, doing content and outreach and those pieces. And that work is super valuable. Don't get me wrong. And there are many wonderful DevRel professionals who do that work very well, far better than I could. But don't just do that at the cost of also what is the experience that people have when they come into the community. I, as a general rule, recommend that you need to give your DevRel people responsibility for the on-ramp into the community. I don't just want someone to go out there and find a developer. I want them to also actively care about the experience that developer has coming into the community. Otherwise, you're only ever incentivizing the sale. You're not incentivizing the success of the sale. And I think that's really critical too.
Yes, these are definitely a lot of challenges and a lot of things to take into consideration when building your community. Jono, what has been your biggest challenge in building a community?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the biggest challenge, frankly, that I would say is entirely personal. It's knowing what to do. It sounds like a very general answer to the question, but there's been times when I've worked with clients, and I was actually having a conversation with a potential client about an hour ago, and there are so many options available of what we can do in building a community. It's knowing what to pick and then having confidence in what you're doing. And when I started out with this, I'd have loads of ideas, but I wouldn't necessarily have the confidence of what I was going to do. Now, I don't really have that as an issue now as a consultant, because I've worked with hundreds of companies and communities. So I've developed I've had an opportunity to kind of try things that work and try things that have not worked. But being able to just narrow down and pick something and do something, I think sometimes people can be overwhelmed with so many options. Even if you just chuck in, considering, let's say, infrastructure. Do we use Discourse? Do we use Slack? Do we use Vanilla? Do we use Chorus? Do we use Bevy? Or what are the things that we use? And I think people can be overwhelmed by that. So that's why I think, start simple, build something, have a clear eye of the value, have a clear eye of the experience that you want to build out, and then go from there. And gradually it becomes easier as you get to know your community, as you get to know your company, as your skills grow, it gets easier. I have the luxury of doing this with lots of different places because I'm a consultant, but most people don't have that luxury. So, just start somewhere and get going.
Yes, and as they say, practice makes perfect.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like a massive cliche, but you're going to fail. You're going to get it wrong. And you got to set those expectations with your management as well. Say, look, we're new at this and we're going to get this wrong. We're going to annoy some community members from time to time. We're going to probably choose the wrong platform and have to move to something else. We're going to spend too much money in swag. It's going to happen. But I think so long as you're always able to learn from those decisions and understand why, then you actually gain something, which is you gain an insight in what not to do, which is half the battle.
Yes, totally agree there. Thank you very much, Jono, for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Repeat where our listeners can get hold of you if they need more from you?
Yeah, so my website is Jono Bacon, JONOBACON.com. You can find out more about what I do. I write a lot of articles, and my books are on there, like People Powered is on there. And my social media is the same, Jono Bacon, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever else. And then People Power, the new book, is available on Amazon and all good bookshops. So
thank you, Jono. And thank you for listening to Under the Hood of Developer Marketing, the podcast devoted to developer marketing and relations. If you want to listen to other episodes, you can subscribe at developermarketingpodcast.com or follow us on Twitter at /DataHQ for regular updates. Thank you, Jono.
Thank you.